23 this morning, Eastern Time, inside the White House Roosevelt Room, Donald Trump did something that has never occurred in the 75-year history of the US-Australia alliance. He threatened America's most reliable Pacific partner with punitive tariffs during what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic call with Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. What happened in the 11 minutes that followed that threat has sent shockwaves through every foreign ministry from Tokyo to Canberra, and the response from Australia's Prime Minister wasn't just defiance. It was a declaration that has united the entire Pacific region against American economic coercion in ways that defense strategists are calling the most consequential realignment in Indo-Pacific relations since the fall of Saigon. I need you to understand something right now. This is not a trade dispute. This is the moment when America's closest allies are being forced to choose between their economic survival and their loyalty to Washington. And what you are about to hear is how one phone call just fractured an alliance that has held together through every major conflict since World War II. If you care about what happens when America's oldest friends stop trusting us, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because what happened today in that 11-minute phone call is already triggering emergency consultations in capitals across the Pacific. And the next 72 hours will determine whether the United States just permanently damaged relationships it took 3 generations to build. Here's what we know, and I want to be very clear about the sourcing, because the details matter enormously. According to 3 independent sources, 2 from the National Security Council and 1 from an aide with direct knowledge of the call, Trump initiated the conversation with Prime Minister Albanese at precisely 9:23 a.m. Eastern Time. The call was scheduled as a standard diplomatic check-in to discuss upcoming joint military exercises in the South China Sea. What those sources confirm is that Trump went off script within the first 2 minutes, demanding that Australia increase purchases of American agricultural products by 40% within 6 months, or face what he called significant consequences. One source described Trump's tone as combative from the opening exchange, using language more appropriate for adversaries than allies. The threat itself was documented in the official call transcript, which was transmitted to senior staff members within 90 minutes of the conversation ending. Multiple people who have reviewed that transcript confirm that Trump specifically mentioned tariffs of 25% on Australian steel and aluminum exports if Canberra failed to comply with demands. Now here's the detail that makes this even more significant than it appears on the surface. Flight tracking data, which is publicly available through multiple aviation monitoring services, shows that within 4 hours of that phone call, 3 separate Australian government aircraft departed Canberra, carrying senior ministers to emergency meetings in Wellington, Jakarta, and Seoul. Someone doesn't mobilize that kind of diplomatic response to a routine trade discussion. They mobilize that response when an alliance is breaking. Before I show you exactly what Prime Minister Albanese said in response, a response that is now being called the most forceful pushback any Allied leader has delivered to Trump in his entire presidency, you need to understand the mechanism that has held the US-Australia relationship together for 75 years, and why what happened today represents a fundamental break from that entire history. Subscribe now if you want to follow where this diplomatic rupture leads, because the implications are staggering, and what I am about to show you is not speculation. This is reconstruction based on direct knowledge from people who were briefed immediately after that meeting ended. Let me walk you through exactly how we got here, because the timeline matters enormously. This did not happen overnight. This was a cascade of decisions, miscalculations, and escalating tensions that have been building since Trump returned to office, and every single step was documented. January 15th, 3 weeks ago, Trump announces sweeping tariff reviews targeting what he calls freeloading allies who are not paying their fair share for American military protection. At a rally in Phoenix, he specifically mentions Australia among nations he claims are taking advantage of American generosity. The statement sends immediate alarm through Canberra, but Australian officials assume this is standard Trump rhetoric designed for domestic consumption rather than actual policy intent. January 22nd. Secretary of State Marco Rubio arrives in Sydney for previously scheduled consultations. Behind closed doors, according to 2 officials present at those meetings, Rubio delivers a blunt message. The tariff threats are real, the White House is preparing a comprehensive review of trade relationships with every ally, and Australia's trade surplus with the United States, running at approximately $18 billion annually, has made Canberra a priority target. Rubio reportedly tells Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong that cooperation on trade demands will determine the future of security cooperation, explicitly linking economic compliance to military alliance obligations. One person in that room described the exchange as the most transactional conversation they had witnessed in 30 years of diplomatic service. February 3rd, 1 week ago. Trump tweets at 6:47 a.m. that Australia and other Pacific allies need to understand that American protection is not free and that countries refusing to balance trade relationships will learn very quickly what happens when the United States stops subsidizing their security. The tweet includes no context, no policy details, just the threat hanging in digital space for the entire world to see. Australian media coverage explodes. Opposition leaders demand answers from Prime Minister Albanese about the state of the alliance. Polling data released 3 days later shows that 63% of Australians believe the United States is no longer a reliable partner, the lowest approval rating for American reliability ever recorded in Australian public opinion surveys. February 7th, 2 days ago. The Australian Cabinet holds an emergency session reviewing contingency plans for what one minister calls a post-American security environment in the Pacific. According to minutes that were leaked to Australian media within hours, ministers discuss accelerating defence cooperation with Japan, South Korea, and India while exploring options for direct bilateral security agreements that do not depend on American participation. The strategic calculus is brutal and clear. If the alliance with Washington has become a liability rather than an asset, Australia needs alternatives immediately. Which brings us to this morning at 9:23, when everything finally broke. Now here's what you need to understand about Anthony Albanese, because this context matters for what happened next. This is not some radical firebrand looking to pick fights with Washington. Albanese is a Labour Party pragmatist who spent the first year of his premiership trying to rebuild relationships with the Biden administration after years of Conservative government skepticism about climate policy and regional cooperation. He visited Washington 4 times in 18 months. He increased Australian defence spending to meet American demands. He committed Australian forces to expanded joint operations across the Pacific. Every single metric shows that Albanese has been trying to strengthen the alliance, not weaken it. So when Trump came at him with ultimatums and threats during what was supposed to be a routine diplomatic call, he was not dealing with someone who had been looking for an excuse to break from Washington. He was dealing with someone who had exhausted every option to make the partnership work and was now being told that none of it mattered. Here's what happened in that 11-minute phone call, and the details come from the official transcript that is now circulating among senior staff across multiple governments. After Trump delivered his demand for increased agricultural purchases and his threat of 25% tariffs, there was a pause. Sources say the pause lasted approximately 8 seconds, which in diplomatic terms is an eternity. Then Albanese responded with language that has already become legendary in foreign policy circles across the Pacific. He told Trump directly that Australia would not be blackmailed. He said that the alliance between Canberra and Washington was built on shared values and mutual respect, not on economic extortion. He reminded Trump that Australian forces have fought alongside American troops in every major conflict for 75 years, that Australian soldiers died in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan defending interests that were often more American than Australian. And then he delivered the line that is now being quoted in every Pacific capital. He said, "If the United States wants to treat its most loyal ally like a rival to be coerced, then Australia will find partners who understand the difference between friendship and exploitation." If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button right now, because this story is about to get significantly more complicated, and you'll want to be here for all of it. Every like tells the algorithm this story matters and helps push this content to people who deserve to know what's really happening before the spin machine has time to bury the truth. The call ended at 9:34 a.m. According to the sources, Trump terminated the conversation without the standard diplomatic pleasantries that typically conclude leader-level calls. No scheduling of follow-up discussions, no agreement to have staff continue negotiations, just silence, and then a disconnect. Within 20 minutes, Albanese was on the phone with Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba. Within 40 minutes, he was speaking with South Korean President Yoon. Within 90 minutes, he was in conference with New Zealand Prime Minister Luxon. The diplomatic mobilization was immediate, coordinated, and comprehensive. But here's what most people do not know yet, and it makes everything I just explained even more significant. At 11:47 a.m. Eastern Time, less than 3 hours after that phone call ended, Prime Minister Albanese held a press conference in Canberra that was broadcast live across every major network in the Pacific region. Standing beside Foreign Minister Penny Wong and Defence Minister Richard Marles, Albanese delivered what foreign policy analysts are already calling the most consequential statement by an Allied leader in the entire post-Cold War period. He began by confirming that he had spoken with President Trump that morning. He did not characterize the conversation as productive. He said that Australia had been presented with demands that were incompatible with Australian sovereignty and economic independence. Then he announced 4 immediate policy responses that have sent shockwaves through Washington and every other Allied capital. First, Australia is accelerating negotiations for a comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and India that would reduce Australian dependence on American markets by an estimated 35% within 5 years. Second, Australia is initiating formal discussions with Pacific Island nations about establishing a regional security framework that does not require American participation, effectively creating an alternative alliance structure in the Pacific that excludes Washington. Third, Australia is suspending new commitments to joint military operations with the United States pending a comprehensive review of whether the alliance serves Australian strategic interests. And fourth, Australia is convening an emergency summit of Pacific leaders in Canberra within 2 weeks to discuss collective responses to what Albanese called economic coercion by major powers. Now here's where it gets dangerous. Within 6 hours of Albanese's press conference, statements of support flooded in from capitals across the region. Japan's foreign ministry issued a release declaring that Tokyo stands with Canberra in defending the principle that alliances cannot be held hostage to trade disputes. South Korea's presidential office announced that Seoul is prepared to expand economic and security cooperation with Australia independent of trilateral frameworks involving the United States. New Zealand's Prime Minister gave an interview to national media saying that Wellington is exploring similar policy responses if Washington continues treating Pacific allies as economic subordinates rather than equal partners. Even the Philippines, which has been moving closer to the United States under President Marcos, issued a carefully worded statement, noting that Manila is monitoring the situation with concern and reserves the right to reconsider defense agreements if American reliability comes into question. Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, every significant Pacific nation has now issued statements that range from explicit support for Australia to carefully calibrated warnings that the region is watching how Washington treats its friends. Smash that like button right now if you understand why this matters beyond the immediate dispute. The algorithm rewards engagement, and your like helps me get this information to the people who need to see it before it's too late. What I'm about to tell you next is what triggered panic inside the White House and among congressional leadership who understand what just happened. At 3:15 p.m. Eastern Time, China's foreign ministry held a press conference in Beijing. The spokesperson was asked about the US-Australia tensions. The response was delivered with barely concealed satisfaction. The spokesperson said that China has always believed that relationships between nations should be based on mutual respect and mutual benefit, not on coercion or threats. The spokesperson noted that China stands ready to expand cooperation with Australia and all Pacific nations that seek partnerships based on equality rather than subordination. Then came the line that has foreign policy experts calling this the most dangerous moment in US-Pacific relations in half a century. The spokesperson said that China welcomes the initiative by Australia to establish regional security frameworks, and Beijing is prepared to participate in any dialogue that promotes peace and stability in the Pacific region. Let me be very clear about what just happened, because this is where most mainstream media coverage is missing the point entirely. China just got handed an opening to fracture American alliances in the Pacific that Beijing has been trying to create for 30 years, And they got that opening not through military pressure or economic inducement, but because Donald Trump handed it to them by threatening America's most reliable ally over agricultural purchases. Every strategic planner in the Pentagon has spent decades working to maintain American alliance networks as the critical advantage over Chinese influence in the region. Those alliances are built on the perception that the United States is a reliable partner that honors its commitments and treats its friends with respect. What Trump did this morning in an 11-minute phone call was destroy decades of that carefully built trust, and China is now positioning itself as the reasonable alternative that treats sovereign nations with dignity rather than extortion. Now here's what concerns me most, and what you need to understand if you are still watching. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because this story is far from finished. According to 4 separate sources familiar with internal White House discussions, Trump's advisors have been trying for hours to walk back the damage, but Trump himself is doubling down. He reportedly told senior staff that if Australia wants to learn the hard way what happens when countries cross the United States, he is prepared to make them an example. One source described Trump as feeling personally betrayed that Albanese pushed back publicly rather than capitulating quietly. And that sense of betrayal is driving him toward escalation rather than de-escalation. The sources indicate that Trump is now actively considering implementing the threatened 25% tariffs on Australian steel and aluminum within days, not months, as a demonstration that his threats are real and that defiance will be punished immediately. Here's what I'm watching for in the next 48 hours that will determine whether this rupture becomes permanent or whether there is still space for diplomatic recovery. First, does the White House issue any kind of clarifying statement attempting to soften Trump's position, or does the administration maintain the hardline stance that allies must comply with American demands or face consequences? Second, do Republican leaders in Congress, particularly those who understand the strategic importance of Pacific alliances, speak out publicly about the danger of alienating Australia, or do they remain silent and allow Trump to continue unilateral destruction of alliance relationships? Third, does Australia follow through on the announced policy responses, particularly the suspension of new military cooperation commitments, or does Canberra signal willingness to negotiate if Washington moderates its approach? And fourth, do other Pacific allies begin implementing similar policy responses to protect themselves from American economic coercion, creating a cascade effect where the entire regional alliance structure begins fragmenting? Hit that like button if you appreciate getting the real story before mainstream media catches up, because what I'm about to show you is the scenario modeling that explains exactly where this goes from here. Let me lay out the 3 scenarios that are now on the table, and I want you to understand that each of these is a real possibility, with the next 72 hours determining which path we are on. Scenario 1. Trump backs down. Probability: I give this maybe 15%. In this scenario, congressional Republicans and senior administration officials convince Trump that the damage to American strategic interests outweighs any domestic political benefit from appearing tough on trade. The White House issues a statement emphasizing the importance of the US-Australia alliance and indicating that trade discussions will continue through appropriate diplomatic channels rather than through public threats. Australia accepts the olive branch, suspends implementation of its announced policy responses, and both sides agree to de-escalate while saving face domestically. The alliance survives but remains weakened, with long-term trust damage that will take years to repair. Scenario 2. Escalation and fracture. Probability: 50% and rising. Trump implements the threatened tariffs. Australia follows through on all announced policy responses, including the suspension of military cooperation commitments. Other Pacific allies begin implementing similar defensive measures, creating a cascade where Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand all start hedging against American reliability by diversifying security partnerships and reducing dependence on Washington. China capitalizes on the opening by expanding economic and diplomatic engagement across the region, positioning itself as the stable alternative to American volatility. Within 6 months, the entire American alliance structure in the Pacific has fundamentally transformed from a hub-and-spoke system centered on Washington to a multipolar framework where regional powers work together, independent of American leadership. This is the nightmare scenario that every American strategic planner has been trying to prevent for 30 years, and it is now the most likely outcome. Scenario 3, partial fracture with regional realignment. Probability, 35%. Australia refuses to back down, but other allies attempt to mediate while protecting their own interests. The result is a Pacific region split between nations that maintain close ties to Washington and nations that pursue independent regional frameworks. Australia leads a coalition of middle powers, including New Zealand, Indonesia, and potentially South Korea, that cooperates with the United States on specific issues, but no longer operates under American strategic leadership. Japan remains closely aligned with Washington, but expands independent defense capabilities to hedge against American unreliability. China gains influence, but not dominance, as regional powers prove more interested in maintaining their independence than in replacing American hegemony with Chinese hegemony. The United States remains a Pacific power, but no longer the Pacific power, and American influence in the region permanently diminishes. Do me a favor and slam that like button right now, because the algorithm determines whether this analysis reaches people who desperately need to understand what is happening while there is still time to pressure congressional leadership to act. Here's what all of this means, and why you should care, even if you are not particularly interested in foreign policy or Pacific alliances. When the United States loses the trust of its closest friends, when American allies start building security frameworks that deliberately exclude Washington, when China gets invited to participate in regional dialogues that were designed to contain Chinese influence, we are witnessing the collapse of the international system that has prevented major power war for 75 years. The post-World War II order was built on American alliance networks that made aggression too costly and cooperation too beneficial to ignore. Those networks depended on the perception that the United States was a reliable partner that could be trusted to honor its commitments and treat its friends with respect. What Donald Trump did this morning was demonstrate to the entire world that American reliability is a fiction, that alliances mean nothing when they conflict with Trump's personal sense of leverage, and that even the most loyal partners can be threatened and coerced the moment they fail to comply with American demands. The implications go far beyond Australia. If Washington treats Canberra this way, why would Tokyo trust American security guarantees? Why would Seoul believe that the United States would defend South Korea if Trump decides that alliance obligations interfere with trade deals? Why would any nation invest in partnerships with Washington when those partnerships can be destroyed in an 11-minute phone call the moment an American president decides to use allies' bargaining chips? The answer is that they would not, and they are not. What we are watching unfold in real time is the disintegration of American global leadership, not because rivals are defeating us militarily or economically, but because we are defeating ourselves by treating friendship like a transaction and loyalty like a commodity to be bought and sold. So what can you actually do about this? Because I know a lot of you are watching this feeling powerless. First, contact your senators and congressional representatives. Tell them that destroying alliances to score political points is not acceptable leadership. Tell them that you expect Congress to assert its constitutional role in foreign policy and to prevent unilateral destruction of relationships that took generations to build. Second, make your voice heard on social media and in your communities. Share this analysis. Make sure people understand what is happening and why it matters. The mainstream media will spin this as a minor trade dispute that will blow over. It will not blow over. This is a fundamental break in the Pacific Alliance system, and people need to understand the stakes. Third, stay informed. Subscribe to this channel right now, because in the next 72 hours, everything could change, and I will be the first to bring you the breakdown before the spin machine has a chance, to bury the truth under false equivalence and both sides' narratives. Here's where things stand right now at this very moment. Australia has announced policies that will fundamentally reduce its dependence on the United States. Every major Pacific ally has signaled support for Australia's position or has issued warnings that they are reconsidering their own relationships with Washington. China is positioned to capitalize on American self-destruction, and Donald Trump is reportedly planning to escalate rather than de-escalate, viewing Australia's defiance as a challenge that must be punished to maintain credibility. The next 72 hours will determine whether American diplomacy can pull back from the brink or whether we just witnessed the beginning of the end of American leadership in the Pacific. This is not hyperbole. This is the assessment of career diplomats, strategic planners, and foreign policy experts who have spent their lives building and maintaining the alliances that Trump is now casually destroying. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Do you think Trump will back down, or is he going to follow through on the tariff threats and permanently fracture the alliance? Do you think congressional Republicans will find the courage to push back? Or will they stay silent while American strategic interests are sacrificed for short-term political theatre? What did I miss? What angle am I not considering? I read every single comment, and your perspectives matter, because this affects all of us, regardless of party affiliation or political ideology. This is about whether the United States remains a nation that other countries want as a partner, or whether we become a nation that even our closest friends no longer trust.